Well, I just want to talk to you about the video I saw with you and Michael Horn.
Right, but I don't know where that's going to go. So.
Oh yeah. All right. So if you want to introduce yourself, if not, I can just speak on what I.
I'm Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics, George Mason University, and I recently did a podcast with Michael Horn about, I guess, in part about UFOs.
Yes, I learned about you first from the interview that you did with Michael Horn, and I also saw an interview. I'm going to be reading from kind of some things I have written down. So, yeah, I saw an interview with you and Lex Friedman, and
Right.
about alien civilizations, UFO, and the future of humanity, and also through your website, manson.gmd.edu.
Hanson, Hanson, yes.
Hanson. My name is Christopher Chalfant. My main focus is the study of the non-religious, belief-free creation's energy teaching presented by Billy Meier. However, I had first had to be satisfied that the UFO extraterrestrial evidence was authentic and credible enough to substantiate the contacts themselves and to warrant studying the information. So my first question was, what did you think of the evidence that Mike Warren showed you? And have you researched the Meier case since the interview?
I have not researched the case, and I thought the evidence was being presented to me not in a form that I could assimilate in that context.
Okay.
That is, as you know, we academics have sort of standard ways that we want evidence to be organized and, vetted, and then we are in the habit of considering such evidence presented in that sort of a organized way, but this wasn't presented in that way, in a way that I could, have much confidence in and how I could evaluate it in that context.
You mentioned data, like arranging it into a data set or something like that.
For example, right?
Yes.
That's one of many of our standard academic habits in how we do data analysis and data presentation. That is often someone will show a statistical analysis of a whole data set. They won't walk us through each item in the data. Sometimes data sets have hundreds of thousands of items, and it would be unproductive usually to walk us through item by item and then ask us to try to somehow intuitively put that together in our head. So people like show graphs, for example, of some A versus B or some statistical test or things like that.
Yeah.
And of course, they usually tell us when they give us a data set, how the data set was constructed, what criteria define the elements of the data set. If you just start listing cases without even having any such criteria, that's even harder to judge, right? So go ahead.
I was going to say, what did you think of the close-up photos of the craft that he showed you?
Well, again, it would be having more context would let one have more confidence in such an opinion. Obviously, you could make such a photograph with just some, metal cans or models or something. Somebody could have made such a photograph that way. So if I'm to put more weight on it than I would put on that sort of photograph, I need to know more about the context of that photograph, right? What do we know about who took it when, who else was watching, what other sensors were recording, right? We want to know a bunch more things.
Yeah, that'd be too much to go into without you researching it on your own.
Well, you could summarize it, but again, most academic papers, most of the time when an academic presents a paper where they're trying to convince people of something with evidence, they usually have a large data set that they're presenting, but they have standard ways of summarizing it so that we feel we could draw conclusions from the data we're being shown. That is, we aren't just shown things randomly one at a time without context. We are presented a systematic,
so if he showed you the photo and then went into detail with all the specifics, where, like you were saying, where it happened, who was there, if there were, okay, so what about the copyrighted verified information? How did that impact you at all, if anything? Because this would be information that was.
That's what I would want a data set of that form, right? These are sort of particular examples of particular datum, supposedly, but they're not organized into a data set. That is, I don't know, how many such things are there, and what is the coding by which we are comparing, coding those things as a prediction and then comparing them to some other later, source about that. How many are we picking from, right? That is, if there was 10,000 of them and you show me 3 of them that seems sort of true, then I might think, well, you were just getting lucky, right? The stop clock is right twice a day sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But if there were only 4 of them and 3 of them were very good, then that's very different, right? You want to know how these things were selected and how they were coded, and then what some sort of a systematic matching procedure, when then some sort of a systematic data that you would talk about a degree of confirmation of each one, and then show some sort of statistically significant test about how different that is from random. That's the kind of thing we do all the time. And so that's the way I would, it would be the same even for a murder trial or something, right?
Yeah.
If you were just going to walk me through some murder place and say that's where he got killed, and he threw a knife from over there, and I'm like, you got to give me more context, right? I mean, if I don't know a lot of sort of murder trial, you don't do that, right? You have people give a whole summary of context, right?
Well, this is good, because now I'm going to take this information and try to maybe put together something like what you're talking about. But is it all right if I just go on to the next question?
Sure, right.
Michael Horn said the confirmed existence of ET and contact with space traveling alien ET life forms would be the most important discovery development in science and history. And you responded, the question is, how important is it exactly to rank the top 20? I'm happy to grant it is pretty important. Therefore, it will overwhelm other things. Whether it's exactly number 1 or number 20 hardly matters. Let's put it up there at the top. Certainly pretty big and important. Do you remember that part of the interview?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then my question is it possible, if we had a scientific, factual, evidence-based case with confirmed contact, then it might disrupt all areas of this topic where falsely spread information and financial gain purely for profit take place?
I'm not following you there, really. It would disrupt. I mean, surely, if it's a big important question, then its answers will be important and they will change things. But I don't know what you're talking about with profit or disruption or these other things.
So basically, along the lines, like, sometimes people create things for the profit scenario, and that if the real cases out there might diminish those other cases, right? And so I'm trying to put it in a way. Yeah.
No doubt any area makes it more difficult if there might be, mistaken data, and certainly intentionally mistaken data. It makes things more difficult. So that's a problem about any area of data. People are lying about the data or making it up, or lying about their analysis. That's going to make, if you suspect that, it's going to make it harder to evaluate it. And
I just meant, like, with one case, if you have all the right information and it's coming from the source, as opposed to other people are just creating this in their head and making it up for financial gain, with that data over here, basically these other people with their false information, they wouldn't be able to put it out there, right? Maybe because,
well, I mean, presumably observers are trying to look for the most reliable evidence in any particular area. So any indicator that suggests something is less reliable, that's going to make people pay less attention to it. So any indicator suggesting something was faked is certainly a reason to pay less attention to it. But observers don't actually know what's faked, so they have to make their judgments based on whatever indicators they can see. And then, of course, that's part of the problem in general with the UFO stuff, is many people do suspect some of it's faked.
Yeah,
I suspect some of it is due to, mistakes and delusions and, mental illness, and just, right, there's a whole range of plausible reasons why the data might not be so reliable, and that's part of the problem. So part of what your challenge is to try to come up with a data set that somebody can believe such that whatever analysis of it, they would then believe the analysis of the data because they believe the data.
All right. My next question, and it'll go in the same kind of scenario where I'll speak what Michael said and then what you said, and then I'll ask a question again. So Michael Horn says, if aliens existed, how and why would they contact us? And you had responded, you bring up the panspermia siblings theory and an overexpansion law. You say that that they could visibly appear and then appeal to us to follow this law, but they didn't do that. And then, you know, I had said, have you considered the Meier case in this evaluation? But you have already said a bunch of times that you haven't personally researched it. And I only say, have you considered it, because it goes in the case, it goes into an overpopulation scenario and our future survival and stuff. So maybe now talking with you, I probably shouldn't have asked that, but I didn't know until now. So maybe I'll just go to the next question unless you want to speak about something about that.
I don't have any, I don't know anything about that to say anything about that. Don't really have anything there.
Okay, so I'm just reading the next question real quick, because if it's even important to ask. All right, well, I'll just ask it anyway. Michael Horn says his opinion is the reason for the Meier contact is to help us assure our very threatened future survival. And you respond that there have been 100,000 UFO sightings, and you say you're not an expert in this area of information, but you think it needs to be taken seriously. My question is, if we had a case of confirmed contact that had vast advice and recommendations for our future survival, had clear, authentic photos, had valuable scientific, economic, health, and other information, would you independently research that case? And would that case have an impact on your theories and area of research?
You ask if there were a case that had certain features, would I research it? But it would have to be, would I know that that case had those features? It wouldn't be enough that the case had the features if I didn't know it had those features.
Okay.
Right. So there could be a completely solid case, but if it doesn't look solid, or I don't know that it's solid, then that doesn't mean I would go study it, right? It's about how it looks.
Yeah, how it's presented, and I see that, and people who think like you, that this data set, it would be really, so I'm gonna very much so.
I mean, the question is how you convince us that it does have these features, right? It's having the features doesn't convince us per se of it having these features, because we could have doubts and think it had other features instead, or suspected other features instead.
So what are some of the ways, I know you've been mentioning this pretty much along the way, but data sets and arranging it with all the best information from that, from all the data, right?
So, I mean, we're talking about somebody who lived decades ago, right? Who lived far up in the mountains.
He's still he's still alive today. Yeah.
Okay, but these events happened decades ago, right?
They're still happening here.
But I mean, how many people are seeing each one, right? If it's just him,
over hundreds, 100 plus.
But each event, but it's
not,
not
during each event.
Yes, for each event, how many people are seeing that one event at that moment? And then how many different cameras, how many different recording devices, how many different testimonies, right? Having one guy say it 100 times is much less persuasive than having 100 people on the same time, right?
Yeah,
because we're trying to exclude the possibility that this guy's making it up, right? So in order to exclude the possibility there's just one guy who makes up a lot of them, then what we want is a lot of other people to see similar things in similar ways and record it with other sorts of devices in many different ways. Have an infrared camera, ultraviolet camera, audio recordings, right?
This was done back in the 90s.
Right, but if you say it's still happening.
The 90s, I'm sorry. But
right,
yeah,
if you say it's still happening, then they should be able to like bring lots of electronics down to bear, right?
The cameras have advanced to this point. So at that point, the cameras you weren't able to modify things. You know how you can go on Photoshop right now and just
right.
So you couldn't do that back then, and that's why it was done back then with a certain type of I think it was the Super 8 film, where these things you couldn't really modify the film like you can today. So there's
that
less.
modification issue isn't really that important. Look, if you had enough people there at the same time with all sorts of separate devices recording things, that would be quite persuasive, right? Especially if they could post the videos, et cetera, immediately after they found them. They could have, you could hire independent investigators, independent people to come out as observers. You could have people with special camera devices that are closed, that can't be opened up, that record things and send them to a website. I mean, there's just lots and lots of different ways. If you say like something is happening in this sort of place, in a predictable place, then there's lots of people you can bring to bear on that.
There's also dangers involved with, there's a reason why it happens to people, him and people around him. And that has to deal with consciousness evolution and where we're at as opposed to where they're at. And so there are reasoning behind how it happened and why it happened.
Okay, but that's differently, and that's like how you are interpreting the data, right? That's theories that help you make sense of the data. But we're just talking about collecting data, right?
Well, this is a theory, if you correct me if I'm wrong, but a theory has facts in it that leads to like.
Okay, but if what you want to say is, it turns out this data is actually really hard to collect, and here's my theory about why it's hard to collect, then I have to consider your theory compared to other theories I can make up about why the data is hard to collect. Obviously, one theory about why the data is hard to collect is it doesn't exist, right? It's not a real thing. So I, as an observer, have to be worried about that theory. If you say, especially if you say, this only works for me and never works for anybody else. Well, that makes kind of suspicious about you and this only working for you, right? The more, that's why I would say the more other independent people who can use independent means to record and measure all this stuff, the better, right? And if you say, this is a special kind of phenomena that is evading and trying to hide from being recorded or being observed, now, that's a theory I should consider, but I should consider it along with the other theories, right? That's the whole point, is to separate the data from the theory generation. But I still want to know your best shot at it. Like, fine, when was the time you had the most people seeing it with the most devices? And, I still want to look at that. That's still my best shot. And if you tell me it wasn't more because, then I have to consider your other theories. But
well, let's go to my last question here. So you say what are the aliens trying to do and why is it the best way? Also, if that the case is in fact real, that doesn't mean you believe everything they say. And my question would be, wouldn't using copyright verified, prophetically accurate scientific information, such as astronomical, pandemic info, geopolitical, and environmental information that forewarned of events years, sometimes decades before they occur or are discovered, coupled with the hard evidence, such as the UFO photos, the films, the video, there's metal samples and sound recordings of these craft, as well as 100+ eyewitnesses, 5 other photographers. Wouldn't that be a pretty good way to prove ET contact?
The context was about, even if I believed there was some strange creature sending some sort of messages there because they showed some unusual powers, even prophetic powers, that doesn't mean I'm going to follow their advice. Doesn't mean I trust that their interests align with mine. Just because, the US military has enormous aircraft that can drop huge bombs on me. I'm convinced of that. Doesn't mean I'll do whatever they tell me. I'm going to follow their advice, right? Just because they can show me they're powerful might make me not fight them, back off, not threaten them, fine, but it doesn't mean I believe everything they say.
There's other contexts with trying to like there's spiritual information, that there's like practical lived experience that they have brought forward that one can verify that way, but I don't think I'll go into that in this interview. But I really appreciate talking with me.
The whole scenario does seem implausible in the sense that you're postulating some enormous power, very well advanced, travels a very long way. It comes here, and then and then it does these things, and then the payoff seems pretty minor compared to all the cost and the other
But
potential things it could
there,
do, right? With the
so
powers that it had, it could have done a lot more.
that's the thing, though. If you come to a civilization and you're touting yourself in front of a civilization, say they're cavemen, and you come in and you have, I don't know, you have a lighter, even just to start fires, you're going to look like a supernatural power, and you could make these beings, dependent upon you, and they
Yeah.
want to avoid that. And so coming in secretly, and in this, not secretly, but coming
Well,
in this
obviously,
kind
just
of,
doing nothing avoids the dependence, right?
well,
If you want to avoid them being dependent on you, do absolutely nothing to them, right? So the question is, why do this little tiny
there,
thing? This is a little tiny
well,
thing.
well,
In the space of things they could do, this is little
mm,
tiny, right? And obviously,
yeah,
if they were trying to warn
but
us about things, they
I
could
don't
just be
think
much
their
more obvious about it,
interests
right?
aren't in to make depend. They're trying to. I think Michael Horn hit on this, and it's to help us to look inside of ourselves for answers instead of outside. That's why the spiritual books and information that have been brought forward I for instance, it's called the Creation's Energy Teaching, and I read
But I
the.
mean, but again, if they wanted to convince us that they had messages that we should believe, they could have been a lot more obvious, right? The kind of evidence you're offering looks a lot weaker than what they could have generated at a very low cost, right? Obviously, they could
Yeah,
have just been a lot
absolutely.
more obvious, right? They
They could
could
have.
have, and so they didn't. And so the question is,
Why?
either they don't want us to know this stuff at all, which is
Mm.
fine, but why would they choose this method to make very difficult to interpret, like complicated evidence that only a few people can figure out, and then have to struggle to
That
persuade
that
everybody else
that
with?
helps
What
us
would be
look.
the point of that?
That helps us to look at the information and then decide what's real and what's not real, as opposed to, geez, somebody else has the information and they bring it forward, and
I
then
mean,
they
they
miss
could have
it.
just been really obvious with this. I mean, right?
Mm.
And then the whole world would be completely convinced they existed, that they had said certain things, right?
Yeah.
They could have just set the huge radio signals in the sky, right? They could
Mm.
have painted fires on the moon. I mean, they could have just, there's
Mm.
lots and lots of ways they could just make really big, obvious signals if they wanted to.
Yeah.
And so, that's part of what I've struggled to explain about UFOs. If UFOs were aliens, how would you make sense of that? And the story I've been able to come up with is they're just trying to be impressive at the periphery of our vision, and that's the main message. That's it. That's all they want us to know, is they exist, they're here,
Why would
they're
they
impressive.
want? Why
Because
though?
we could conclude from that they want us to not break their rule of against interstellar colonization. As we can just figure out that if they exist and they are here, they are older than us, then they could have filled the galaxy. They did not fill the galaxy, therefore they must have had a rule against that. And then that's the obvious reason why they'd be here, to have us follow their rule.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all. If we're smart, we can figure that out. So they don't need to tell us anything more.
Why is there such a difference in the photographs the military shows us with, these, and then you look at the Meier case, and the crafts are crystal clear. I just, what would you give for a difference? Not even looking at the cases and just the photographs. Why do you think there would be a difference between all the photos we've seen prior, and then the Meier case with the
Well, I
clear?
mean, the obvious explanation is it's fake, right?
Mm.
I mean, that's the obvious explanation that cries out to you. You say, this will sure look sharp. Why haven't I heard about this? Why isn't there clear evidence about
Why
this?
why wouldn't the ones that you can't see really be fake though? Why would the better footage be fake, and as opposed to,
if you were close enough to get that good of footage, then you ought to have a lot of other persuasive evidence, right?
there is a lot of other persuasive evidence, like the copyright verified prophetically accurate information. There is other eyewitnesses. There's books. There's tons of spiritual information and books that have been published that help with self-development and consciousness evolution.
So I guess my main point would be to say, in the worlds that I come from, there are standard ways that you try to organize evidence to persuade people of it. And
Yeah.
they're not that different from, say, if you were a police detective, right? There are standard ways you will organize the evidence of a police detective in order to persuade people of it. Or if you're a marketing person in business and you're trying to convince a business to buy your marketing material, right? There's just, in a lot of other parts of the world, there are standard ways in which you try to organize data in a systematic way in order to convince people that it's real data they should believe and act on, right? And so
Yeah.
you guys, from what I was shown by Michael Horn, I was not shown evidence in that sort of a form.
And I'd like to do that next, if we could, eventually. I don't know if you would like to do this again. I really appreciate doing this in the first place. But later on, maybe if I can get the information in that way, would you have me again to look at?
I'm not going to make any promises now. You could ask me then, and I'll see what happens then. But but I presume, like, this isn't my specialization. Somebody else out there must look at the stuff. Surely somebody else must have looked at the stuff.
Yeah, but by you talking to me like this, and so now I can get the info, put the information together in a way that other people like you and like-minded people like you can look at it and decipher it in a way that's more valuable. So for that, that's
But just so there's a standard, like, it's something custody, like for all kinds of evidence, like for detectives or other things, there's or even for what's called, like, for art that you worry about being forged or something, right? There's standard ways that people show the custody of evidence, like who had it when, how has it been stored, who are you supposed to trust that it wasn't messed with, who's the first person it was reported to, how do they verify, right? Just in a lot of different areas, we have these standard procedures exactly to overcome doubts about evidence, right? So when there's a murder, as you know, or whatever, the detectives all show up with their photographs and they lay down tape and they put numbers on things. They take a bunch of pictures, and a bunch of people are there all at the same time. Why? That's exactly like to establish the idea that this is exactly the way they found it. And you wouldn't want to question that, right? But the way they do it is have a whole bunch of people show up at the same site at the same time and follow some standard procedures to collect the evidence in a standard way. And then they have standard ways they organize that exactly so that the jury or the defense attorneys can look at that evidence, question it, and evaluate it, because it's been collected in a standard way to make it easy to see that it wasn't messed with, right? And so, especially if you've got some evidence people are tempted to doubt, it's all the more important that you try to, as clearly as possible, put together that sort of custody of evidence documentation and organize it such a way that you could convince people that this thing that it purports to be is what it really is.
Yeah, I know exactly.
It's just this one guy, so if this has been happening for decades, then surely, okay, maybe the first few times he wasn't very organized, but after that, like people like me, if you talk to them and say, this is how you're supposed to organize things, and then he could go organize it that way. And then presumably for decades afterward, he could have had the data in a standard organized way, right? And if he was warned and he chose not to do that, then you have to wonder why. If you never talked to anybody over all these decades about how you're supposed to organize evidence to convince people of things, then you have to wonder why I never talked to anybody about that. I mean, these are my questions.
Yeah, well, that's a good question to ask, and I'll probably also ask that question because I'm unsure how that whole chain of I've actually seen it because I've researched other UFO stuff, and Alan J. Hynek was big on that,
right? What
you're talking about, and so that's the first.
For good reason, and he was one of the most respected people for that reason.
Yes, and so I don't. So there was another way I verified this case was the practical experience. So basically, logically, what he was writing about, I was able to practically use for my own self-development and consciousness evolution. So I didn't like I saw the photos and all that stuff first, but that wasn't what stuck me more to everything in the whole. But so I'm gonna actually ask and find out if and how the evidence was handled and stuff like that, because I didn't go into that part of the case. So
anyway, been nice talking, and good luck with your project.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.